If you are like most people, then the first place that your mind goes when I talk about barefoot walking and hiking is the hazards, the injuries, the blood. That's what you think about. Now, most people don't think about the unseen hazards, which tend to be a much bigger deal, but we just think about the things that are visible and punctuated by pain. So we're going to go there, and I'm going to tell you how I divide injuries into three categories from most mild to most severe. And I'm going to tell you what I learned, because the simple existence of a hazardous thing that might hurt your foot that's nearby, just that being there, even if it's right in your path on the ground in front of you, that's not enough to cause a foot injury. You have to be out of it mentally to get the foot injury, or you have to be unprepared, unwise, not thinking critically. That's what leads to injuries, because usually you're able to avoid it. Even if you're a barefoot walker normally, if you work construction, you're going to wear steel-toed boots when you're on the construction site, because we're able to evaluate different settings and different risks. Now, I'm going to be talking about my experiences hiking trails in Utah, residential areas in Utah where I am, and in town and everything. But of course, when I'm in other places, there are other risks. So I can't speak to that, which is why you need to assess it. If you live in Newark, I took a trip to New York City and we were staying in Newark. Now, sorry, Newark, maybe the rest of you is amazing, but we just were a mile away from the train station. And that mile walk, I was wearing closed-toed shoes the entire time just because of the number of different things that were on that path from point A to point B. So if you live in a place like that, you're going to have to go far away if you want to do the barefoot walking. When we go stay in San Antonio with my in-laws, very different types of risks, and I've just learned over time it's a different system for me there. Okay, so speaking of my day-to-day life, I have rated injuries from mildest being puncture wounds, medium would be splinters in your skin or other anomalies in your skin that are actually worse than puncture wounds, and I'll tell you why. And then the last category is going to be toe kicks. Now, I understand how, of course, the mild category could be made the worst category, but I am saying that puncture wounds don't usually get that bad because you have the ability to assess where you're walking. And if you are out of it enough to step on a metal spike that goes all the way through your foot so it comes out the top, then you're not really doing your job as a barefoot walker. So it's pretty rare to step on something that's a really bad puncture wound because we have eyesight. Now, this is going to bring up the number one reason why I get bad injuries, which is if you walk after dark barefoot. Terrible idea, but we're going to get into that with the stories. The most mild is when your foot is punctured by something natural, not something man-made, just a plant, like goat's heads, which are colloquially referred to as stickies, you know, those things that stick to your clothes and they hurt to pull off because they're spiky. There's those, there's little thorns, any number of plants that can puncture your foot. These are the least big deal. If you are doing your job as a barefoot walker, you have incredible circulation in your feet. And so the only drama is in pulling them out, and then you just go about your day. I have never been affected, even by the worst plant puncture wounds. I've never been affected once I got it out of my foot. We were on a hike to Lone Peak that I talk about in the other video, and I pulled a pretty big spike out of my foot that was just a plant. Not a big deal at all. The only drama is in getting it out, so you have to get through that drama. And I will point out, you can make it much worse if you're acting. If you're acting out to your friends and saying that it's so bad while you're pulling it out, it'll make it hurt worse. So drop the drama, get it out of your foot as fast as you can, and move on, because this happens, it's the most frequent and it's the least big deal. And as your calluses thicken, and I will say, it's not gross calluses like people have uneven on different parts of their foot, because people who aren't barefoot walkers, they'll have just a callus on the edge of their heel or just on their toe, and it's just this uneven. That's why it's gross. Calluses for a barefoot walker, you can't see them because the entire sole of my foot, there's a perfectly even callus across all the parts that make contact with the ground. So it's very smooth, it's imperceptible, you can't see it. I think it looks a lot better than people who have those uneven calluses just on the edge of their heel and just on the place where there's friction between their toe and the shoe. It's not like that. So I just want to give that plug for barefoot calluses. They're not ugly. Now, as the skin on the entire sole of your foot thickens evenly and beautifully, you're going to feel those plant things less and less. So whereas a goat's head used to be a much bigger deal, now if a goat's head gets stuck on my foot, I hardly feel it. But then I realize that I'm stepping on it, and so I pull it out. Now, the other type of puncture wound can be worse, and there's only one reason why. It can be much worse because if it's a man-made object that's like metal or anything, there might be, from all the dirt and germs that gather there, there might be this possibility of tetanus, or I know that hepatitis can live on surfaces. Now, before you freak out, just realize, number one, you have to assess where you live. I live in a place with a pretty low risk, and that's why I don't worry about it. When I'm anywhere else, I'm much more concerned. Even if I go into other cities within my state, I'm much more concerned about that. Now, if you're worried about people's hypodermic needles and the stuff that's in their body getting onto their needles that they drop on the street, that's a very dramatic thought. Now, if there were to be hypodermic needles that were used to shoot something up, generally if they are left on the ground, it's going to be laying flat. It would be pretty hard for it to get into your foot. It would have to be situated in a really weird way. Same thing with nails. If you're dumb enough to walk through somewhere that has a bunch of 2x4s and some of them might have nails sticking out of them, then that's your problem for being unintelligent. But that's kind of the only way that a nail can go into your foot, is if it's facing straight up or like this. And generally, if the nail doesn't have something that it's attached to, it's going to be laying flat on the ground. So personally, I've never had any issues stepping into a long metallic object that's sharp, because it would have to be sticking up out of the ground and I would have to miss it. And that would really require a lot of negligence on my part. Now, it is possible, though, that you step on some jagged metallic surface that's gathered up a lot of rust and dirt and bacteria, and then you get an infection, which is why if you were to step on something man-made, and you will know because the puncture does a lot of more damage than a plant, you have to look into what it was that you stepped on. I have never personally stepped on a man-made object that was made out of metal, because I'm good at looking out for them. And again, I'm in a low-risk area, so it's much easier to look out for them because they're not very frequent. But of course, if you were to step on something like that, then you got to be concerned. This all goes back to critical thinking, though. Don't do barefoot walking in a place where it's even a little bit likely that that kind of stuff is there. Now, what I have stepped on, this was the worst puncture wound, and it was still in the mild category, is that there was highly familiar grass that I walk on all the time because it's on my way out of my very street that I live on. And my neighbors had always put a cone over this one area on the side strip of their lawn, because I'm not going to disrespectfully walk in their yard, but sometimes I'll walk on the side strip right off the sidewalk. There was always a cone there, and I had never registered that it was there. I thought it was just out of the way. I didn't realize it was covering something up, but it had been blown away by the wind. Now, into the unintelligent part of the story. I was barefoot walking at dusk, and I didn't see what was coming. Now, that is why the number one reason why you get hurt when you're barefoot is if you're dumb enough to barefoot walk like me at dusk. This is kind of the reason why I stopped doing it, was from stories like this. So the next day I could see it perfectly, but because I was walking in dimmer lighting that was getting ever dimmer, I stepped on it used to be a sprinkler head coming up out of the grass, but the sprinkler head had been taken off and this jagged PVC pipe had been exposed. And I stepped on it and it went into my foot. I quickly identified the object and I was like, okay, so it's not metal. It doesn't seem like it's something that's like been in someone's body or the risk was fairly low for a PVC pipe, but of course you're concerned because there might be dirt and different types of bacteria on that. So I came home and rinsed it really well, hydrogen peroxide. I can't remember what I did, but I cleaned it. And no further problems seemed to happen as time went on. And then I had a decision to make, which was, should I start walking on it or should I take the weight off of it? And luckily I made the right decision. Now, it is possible for something to be bad enough that you should take the weight off of it, but this was mild enough that taking the weight off of it was not the right thing to do, because once I realized I can tolerate the pressure of stepping on it, I can tolerate putting weight on it, then I started barefoot walking even so, but it was covered with a nice thick bandage. And as I was walking, this wound was on my heel. And so you get a lot of impact on your heel as you're walking. But that gentle pressure of each step brought fresh circulation there, and it healed really fast. I don't know if it would have healed without the circulation that comes from barefoot walking. So I'm really glad that I made that choice. Now, the reason why I always put puncture wounds as the most mild is because, number one, they tend to be really mild because I'll avoid the worst things by critical thinking and eyesight and it being light outside. And then if I still step on something, as long as the wound is cleaned out and everything, once I can get it to tolerate weight, which is usually instantly, As I walk on it, it just heals really quickly because of the pressure of each step brings the blood flow and it just starts healing up. So I was actually on a walk with my sisters heading back from a very familiar place, and I was walking on familiar grass, and I stepped on something, and I made sure it wasn't something that I would be concerned about stepping on, but it had gone into my foot. And so I was like, oh, what do I do? And then I wanted to get off the grass because a little blade of grass going into a wound, like tickling it, that can be excruciatingly painful. And also you want to, once you're kind of like worried because you stepped on something, you want to avoid the unknowns of grass. Grass seems so mild, but it's actually very evil. It can hide so many things. So I got off the grass and I was walking just on the sidewalk, on the concrete. Now, usually I'm not an advocate of the hard and flat, but the hard and flat was so therapeutic because it was very known. And so my gait pattern wasn't messed up by being scared of stepping, like, what's going to be there? What's going to be there? So I was very relaxed because I could see everything on the sidewalk in front of me. And then that pounding of each step, that gentle pounding, because walking is not falling when you're a barefoot walker, but that gentle pounding brought blood flow. And so even though I thought when I got home I was going to have to treat it and everything, by the time I got home I forgot that I had stepped on anything because the blood flow had come in and started to restore the area already. So that's it for puncture wounds. Now the middle thing would be skin anomalies that are not puncture wounds. Why did I make this worse than puncture wounds? Shouldn't puncture wounds be the worst? Well, as long as you're not dumb enough to step on a nail that's sticking out of a wooden plank, and I don't know why you're walking barefoot there. As long as you're not dumb enough to do those sorts of things, if you get a puncture wound, it tends to be on places that your foot is constantly making contact with the ground and that gentle pounding against the ground. And it's just so easy to heal them because wherever you have the wound is where you get the most blood flow when you're walking. It's the place where you have a callus. The reason why you build up that callus is because you're getting tons of blood going to that deepest layer of your skin, and then it's building out the callus further. So it just tends to be the easiest to recover from. And usually a puncture wound is just like a pinprick size, and so it's just almost never a big deal. Okay, so now number 2 is going to be the, as I said, skin anomalies that might get to you more because they're not so easy to heal from, or they're just complicated in a different way. So when the weather changes, I notice mostly it's when summer turns into fall. The earth gets more dry and cold, and that leads to a higher likelihood of splinters. Now, splinters can be harder to avoid because it'll be a place that I walk all the time. I walk across bark a lot, just the wood chips in different landscaping setups, and then all of a sudden the season will get to this certain point where everything gets a little more cold and dry, and then all of a sudden I have a splinter. And it usually happens when I least expect it, and I have gotten splinters from walking in the grass and places where I wouldn't have expected it. If a certain group of bark or a certain area seems high risk because it's all really dry and crackly and stuff, of course I'm not going to walk there, so I avoid them that way. Once it happens, if you couldn't have reasonably avoided it and you have a little splinter in your foot, at that moment, if you can avoid stepping on it and get home and try to see if it's sticking out, then maybe you could quickly pull it out. But often I'll get a splinter in the middle of a walk and I go on and on and on. And as I'm walking, the splinter is going to go deeper into my foot because I didn't, there might be a critical period to pull it out when it's not fully in yet. But if I get home and I've put a lot of weight on it already and it's already gone pretty far into my foot, I have determined over time that it's better to just get used to walking on it, and eventually your body will just absorb it and break it down, because the creation of a wound to get the splinter out once it's deep, that wound is going to irritate you a lot more on barefoot walks than the splinter. That wound, I don't know, it could get bigger, you could start picking at it, it just hurts more no matter the way you step on it. Whereas if you just let the splinter be, usually it'll only hurt like every 100 steps. I'll step on it at the wrong angle and it'll hurt and I'll go, ooh, and then I'll just keep walking. And then within a few days, I don't feel it anymore and it all just gets absorbed. So I leave splinters alone. My advice to you would be, if you're very paranoid about splinters, then when you barefoot walk somewhere that you might get them, which is anywhere, because like I said, I got it on grass just outside my house that I had never gotten splinters on before. If you're really paranoid about that, carry a pair of tweezers in your pocket and see if you can pull it out in the moment you get it without stepping on it again, because I think that's your only chance to pull it out without making a big exit wound because you had to dig into your foot to get it out. When summer turns to fall, My skin has gotten really thick from all the barefoot hiking in the summer, the skin on the bottom of my feet. And like I said, it's so even that you can't see it, but it's all very thick and tough. And the thing is that there are certain spots on your feet where there is a natural breaking point for that skin once the temperatures drop. So all the skin is smooth and intact, but then do you know how where your toes bend, there's those little creases? Now I build up thick skin on the general, like the pads underneath the segments of the toe, but those creases are weak spots because of the way the toe bends. And then that thick skin on both segments is separated by this weakness of this crease. And a couple times, the first fall and the second fall that I walked barefoot, those creases would just open up. The skin would just open up because the crease is such a weak point between two strong points. That's usually where you get an injury, is where you have an overbuilt strong point and then you have a weak point. And that weak point opened up. Now, the feeling of that crease being open and then like a blade of grass getting in there and tickling it is just exquisitely painful. It is much more disturbing and hard to live with than a puncture wound. Because a puncture wound, you know exactly what it is. You start pounding on it with every step, it starts to heal up. If you need to pound on it on the sidewalk so that there are no unknowns and the sidewalk is really nice and high impact, it'll just heal right up. But that little spot under my toe, I could not figure it out, because in that crease of my toe where there's a very strong spot interfacing with a very weak spot, the skin simply would not close up. So it's possible that with time, my little creases are just getting more robust. The skin in there is finally evening out with the skin everywhere else on the underside of my toes. So I think that might be why it didn't happen. But I also think that I have more reasonable threshold for temperature. And so last fall, I think the reason why this didn't happen as much, I don't think it happened at all, actually. Last fall, so I'm in May right now, but last fall before it changed to winter, I think I realized once the temperature drops below a certain point, it's not that advantageous to walk barefoot anyway, because your feet can't be that pliable. But if your feet can't be pliable, then your skin definitely can't be as pliable and it will become rigid. And then that little weak spot is more likely to open up. And so below a certain temperature, I would just put on my minimalist shoes. And I found minimalist shoes that I liked a lot better. I had the Soft Star buckskin sole. So as long as it wasn't wet outside, if it was just that fall frost, I would put on my Soft Star Run-A-Mucks that have buckskin soles, so I was still grounding and it was so flexible and nice and breathable. I would just put those on and it would keep my feet warm enough that that little split didn't happen, because the skin didn't have to become so rigid. But I also think that the skin in that little crease is just toughening up with the rest of my foot over time. For whatever reason, it didn't happen. But when I was in the process of that happening, there would be times that I'd be out somewhere and I had planned to walk home just for enjoyment. And then instead I would call my husband if I realized that I had one of those little creases had split open and I didn't have any way to cover it up. I would call my husband because I couldn't walk on it. That's how big of a deal skin anomalies are. They're so much bigger of a deal because they're going to happen in a place where just simply stepping on it and bringing blood flow is not enough, because they're in those little nooks and crannies. Now, generally I would prepare this way. I would bring, so this is a normal roll of 3M micropore tape, but if you have a roll that's almost gone like this, then it's quite portable. I could fit it in a pocket. I could fit it in whatever I'm carrying my phone in if I don't have pockets. If you're really desperate, you could just carry it on a finger while you're walking. Just bend that finger a little bit and you got it. As long as I have it tucked away somewhere, then I can fashion a really quick makeshift skin cover-upper for my toe. So what I'll do is I'll rip off a piece that's not so big, and then since it's wider than I need for my little toes, I'll rip off a thinner piece of it. So now I have a strip that's been ripped longitudinally, and then I'll fold over a part of it so that it's not sticky on the spot that's making contact with the open skin. And then I'll wrap this around to secure that on, and then I'll wrap around the other half that I tore up to reinforce it and keep covering it up. And you can wind more tape around it, and you're basically reinforcing your skin with a little makeshift band-aid made out of 3M micropore tape. So I would do that, and as long as I taped it up, I was good. Now that is kind of just an in-the-moment solution, because you're not toughening up the skin in that little crease. But it was just the way that I got through, and like I said, it stopped happening. But I'm just letting you know that it could, especially if you're in a climate where you have all 4 seasons and winter gets really cold. That's going to be a liability in the fall. I ordered this sandbar, And it's basically a device that you can file your calluses down with. Now, I might be wrong about this, but I don't think that like rock climbers want to file their calluses away. Now, people who use sandbar might just be CrossFit training and they think their calluses are ugly and so they'll file them off their hands. I don't know. It depends on who you are. Now, filing away your calluses would be not advisable for a barefoot walker, but if I start having this issue, I'm going to use the sandbar to even out the interface between the callus and the part of the skin that's not calloused over. So basically I would want to be evening out the edges of that thick skin underneath the segments of my toe so that it could more smoothly transition into that crease, because I think it's just the interface of such thick skin with such thin skin. That way you can prevent the edge of the callus like peeling away or opening up or anything like that, but it's only to smooth across the edges and the transition points. Moving on to the last one. So the skin anomalies can be very irritating, much more irritating than a puncture wound. And now that we're at the last one, this is where it gets into the mental process that is going on all day long, especially when you're barefoot walking or hiking. Toe kicking. If you don't know what this is, I mean, ask somebody. Surely it's happened to you before. It's kind of like jamming your toe, but when you're barefoot walking, your foot that usually somehow just smoothly goes like this, all of a sudden you'll jam your toe, it'll just face plant into the ground. Now, I have never kicked my toe open when I was in a relaxed, focused state. Ever. The only times that I kick my toe is when I'm thinking an anxious, panicky thought. And it's usually that I'm on a barefoot walk home from something, and then I'm mentally reviewing, how did I teach that class? How did I do that? And I start getting really self-conscious. I'm like, oh, I said a fact wrong to them. That phonological category, I had it completely backwards. And then boom, that's when I kick my toe. Or when I'm thinking about someone that I dislike and I'm like, man, that was just such a pain in the neck today. Boom, that's when I kick my toe. So the reason why toe kicking can be the most frequent injury that you get is because anytime you mentally check out, that's when it happens, at least for me. If you are in touch with your mental process and your mental flow, you will realize that you don't kick your toe when you're like in the zone. You kick your toe when you're worrying about something else. Now, I am not a proponent of only living in the present and everything. I believe that the human ability to plan for the future is what makes us so different and unique from other animals. So I'm not saying you can only live in the present, but I'm saying when you're just worrying and it's usually some sort of ruminating fixation on the past or some anxious worry about how it's definitely going to go wrong in the future. Those types of indulgent negative thoughts that take you totally out of your ability to assess your environment, those are the ones that cause me to kick my toe. Now, I would say that if you are on a longer barefoot hike, it's good to carry around the almost gone roll of 3M micropore tape, just in case you need to make a makeshift Band-Aid if you really hurt it. Now, usually when I kick my toe open, I don't cover it up. I just keep walking. Basically what it is a scrape on the top of your toe is usually what happens. So my foot will kind of nosedive into the ground in a really ungraceful way, and I'll scrape the skin that's nearby my toenail, and so it'll bleed, usually only a little bit, and then usually it just stings and I'm a little irritated. Now, fixating on it makes it worse, always. So usually I'm just like, oh, that's really unfortunate. But if I sit there and verbally punish myself in my head for, oh, you weren't focused, what were you thinking? Then you just start feeling like a sad puppy dog. So usually I'm just like, oh, that was a little reminder, I need to focus. And then I just get back into the gentle cadence of my barefoot walk, and I get home, and you can rinse it off in hydrogen peroxide and everything, but usually it's just basically that you've just scraped up the top of your toe. So here's the worst thing that ever happened to my feet from a barefoot injury. It's definitely not the worst thing that's ever happened to my feet, because the worst thing that was ever happening to my feet was when I was wearing shoes all the time. But when it comes to the barefoot stuff, I decided to take a sunset walk with my husband on a mountain trail. It's a very mild mountain trail, but it overlooks the valley. And we decided to just go take a walk and talk about life and just enjoy the evening together. This was last fall, and I decided that since it was getting later in the fall, I was going to miss barefoot hiking so much when the snow started falling. It was so good for my feet and my hips and everything. I was just going to miss it so much in my routine that I insisted on doing this barefoot. Now that was my huge mistake, is that I left my shoes in the car and I should have had them in hand. And I could have known to have them in hand. There are a lot of times that I bring nothing on a barefoot hike except myself, but I should have had them in hand because number one, I didn't know if the temperatures were going to drop a lot. It was late fall. And number two is that it was almost sunset. So I figured it was just going to be really quick. It's not a long trail. We'll be done pretty soon. So we go out on this walk and it's feeling good. And it's not warm, but it's not so cold that I can't handle it. And we're just da 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 da. And then we reach this overlook and we stop and we talk and we talk and we talk. And the sun goes down. And then I go, oh, it's dark now. Let's walk back. And so I'm feeling it out with my feet. I can't really watch the ground anymore. It's too dark. So the number one mistake is that if I wanted my little dose of barefoot because I was going to miss it, then I should have given that to myself with shoes in hand. So that was very foolish of me, very, very foolish. But then number two is the emotional side. So you don't kick your toe usually unless you're in a frenzied state of mind. And for whatever reason, I decided to just start going nuts. As it gets darker outside, I usually get more stress later at night and I get more disagreeable for silly reasons that are not justified. And I know this. Also, you have this added layer of if you're really taken with somebody, it tends to make you either much better or much worse at everything you do. So Alex Honnold, if you saw Free Solo, according to the way that it was presented in the documentary, he had never taken a fall before until he's with this girl that he's quite taken with. And then he gets these horrible injuries from falling. So that distraction level from being with someone that you have a romantic entanglement with, that was at play as well. Because I had in the past injured myself more when I was barefoot hiking and my husband was there compared to when he wasn't there. In fact, that story that I told in the other video about going to Colorado and Hanging Lake and the first time I ever hiked barefoot, on the way down, my husband was racing down. His legs are a whole lot longer than mine and he was just racing down and I was going to keep up with him really, really, really fast, just racing down the trail. And that's when I lost my footing on a very smooth rock and I slipped and I hit my foot, but it was not a big deal. I iced it in the river. It immediately felt better. But anyway, yeah, when you're with someone that you're just so taken with, usually either you're amazing and showing off, and that happens all the time where I'm just gliding on this barefoot hike if my husband's there and I'm going way faster because his legs are so much longer than mine and I'm just like, look how good I am at this. Aren't you impressed with me? The other side of that is that I am more subject to that distraction or irritability if we're getting in a petty argument. So we're back to this hike that we took last fall. That was the worst barefoot injury I've ever had. Our only goal is to get back to the car. I can't see anything. I'm just like getting through it, whatever. I'm no longer being technical about it. I just got to get back to the car. And we see this headlamp on a trail high above us. And my husband goes, wow, that guy's really booking it. He's not hiking, he's running, and he's running incredibly fast. And I look at the headlamp and I'm like, he's not going that fast. He's just hiking. And he goes, no, he's really fast. And I keep looking, no, he's not. And I am just really flustered and disagreeable. And he's like, no, he is. And I'm like, I'm looking right at him, boom! And my foot crashes into a rock really hard, like, nose dives into a rock. And then I'm squatting down, holding myself from the pain, just like that initial moment of, oh my gosh, that hurts so bad. And then I look up at the headlamp on the trail up above, and I'm like, wow, you're right. He's running really fast. So he was actually right on that, and it was just the pettiest, silliest thing. So my two mistakes that it could have made me easily avoid this problem were, number one, I should not have gone without shoes. And if I wanted that little bit of barefoot at the beginning, I should have had them in hand so I could slip them right on as the sun started setting and I couldn't see the trail anymore. I should have figured we would have been out talking longer and that we would have been out past sunset. And then number two is that I wasn't focusing on staying calm and kind of in that zone. I was getting into a petty argument. Now, I used to blame the presence of my husband for that, but it's definitely not him because it's not a cursed thing to barefoot hike with him around. We took a really amazing hike that I was barefoot on just a couple days ago and nothing happened. It was completely graceful. So you can't give your responsibility for your mental control off to other people. You can't outsource that to anybody else. It's yours. But I was very wrong in this petty argument and it totally took my focus away from keeping my feet moving in a good, like technically smooth manner. And so that's the reason why it happened. And then the reason why it was so bad wasn't even just that. It's that in order for my foot to heal, I need to have that excellent circulation that comes from hiking barefoot. And the hiking barefoot has healed my feet from worse impact injuries. In fact, I was on a hike probably, I think, last summer. If you know the trail in Utah, it's off the Alta Ski Resort parking lot. If you know the Mount Superior Trail, you know that it gets really treacherous. It starts out like the hikes that I just take daily that are local, really close to my house, but then it turns into just basically this big pile of like sedimentary slabs of rock that are just sliding down the hill. It's just a big pile of pieces of rock. And as we were doing this hike, I was like, man, I'm going to slip off this mountain. You're holding with your hand, you're just crawling basically because you're on basically a huge pile of rocks and you're afraid that one's going to slide down and you're going to slide down with it. And we were scrambling up a certain part and my little brother is up ahead of me, scrambling up higher than I was. And he dislodged a pretty big piece of rock, like a big boulder sized thing. And it comes rolling down quick and it smashes into my toe. And I go, ah! I exclaim from the pain. We get up that part and keep going. And I just, from that rhythmic pressure of each step, the blood flow came. By a mile or two past that point, I was not in pain anymore. By the end of the hike, I forgot that it had happened. There was no lasting injury. Okay, so the circulation from the barefoot hiking is the miracle of barefoot hiking. So as long as the injury is not in a certain hard to reach part of your foot that makes it a lot harder for it to heal, barefoot hiking can cause an injury and then barefoot hiking can be the cure to that injury. It is its own cure. It is its own medicine because it's just a very holistically healthy activity. So usually I rely on subsequent barefoot hikes to recover from whatever happened to my feet. And it always works because circulation is what heals. The blood has to get there. Just eating doesn't bring the nutrients everywhere far spread out in your body. You have to move those parts to get the blood there. I have much more dense capillary system in my feet now than before I was a barefoot hiker. So I need the blood to go there from the movement, from the interfacing with the rocks and the trail and everything. Here's the thing. It was right at the end of fall, and I have learned all my lessons about what happens when you barefoot hike in the cold. It's just not as beneficial. So I start slipping my mucklucks on very quick because the snow, the fresh snow that you can't barefoot walk on, was falling very soon after that, within a couple days. And the mucklucks are amazing. They keep my feet warm and dry, but that thick sheepskin insole and just the fact of wearing a big rubber sole and everything, and the fact that you have a little bit less ankle mobility, and the fact that even if you were barefoot, the trail's all smoothed out with snow anyway. It's no longer that pressure of each rock pushing into your foot. So I started hiking a lot in the mucklucks, and it was great for everything else, but there's a lot less blood flow to your feet when you're hiking in mucklucks. And of course it was the right thing to do. I would go to yoga practices during the wintertime, and that moment, if you do yoga, that moment when you go from upward facing dog where the tops of your feet are supporting the weight, and then all of a sudden you roll through your feet to get to downward dog, that rolling moment would be very painful to me. And I could feel that there was some internal bruising or something that had happened that I was not able to really heal. Now, yoga helped a lot. The movement of my feet rolling between upward facing dog and downward facing dog, at first it would be really icky and sticky, but then the more I'd move through it, the more the blood flow would come and it would help. But the healing was super slow because it was wintertime and I couldn't actually do the barefoot hike that I needed. So for the longest time, anytime I would go to yoga, I would feel the injury in that foot. And that's why I consider it the worst, is that it took so long to heal from. Because probably that boulder smashing into my foot was a worse injury if you look at the acute moment and how much I cried out and how much just smashed into my foot. You know, how hard the impact was. I think that one was worse, but because I was able to keep on barefoot hiking on a hot day, all that circulation just immediately made it better. So the big problem with this story was that I was dumb enough to make this mistake when I was walking with my husband. I was dumb enough to be barefoot in the dark at the end of fall when I wasn't going to have a barefoot hiking opportunity to heal myself. Now, could I have done it better to accelerate the healing? Yes, I could have. I could have taken care while indoors because it was snowing outside. I could have taken care to roll out my feet on many different sizes of massage ball of different levels of hardness and to give myself circulation in my feet in many other ways. Now, nothing is the same as the holistic experience of the barefoot hike. It heals everything all at once. And so I think just massaging and rubbing my foot to get blood to go there, it's not the same because there's not that pressure of supporting weight. When I'm supporting weight and rolling the weight through my feet on a barefoot hike and all the rocks are pressing in, that's what does it. And so, but I probably could have done something to approximate that experience while indoors. But the deal was that I decided in life that my number one priority isn't always health and healing for health and healing's sake. We only believe in health and healing because it helps facilitate all of our other activities. And I was well enough that I was a busy grad student taking graduate courses and teaching lower level courses that graduate students teach, and also teaching the upper level courses that I had previously taught and that I continue to teach. So no, I was not going to hyper focus on my foot. And I think the fact that I didn't fixate on it and the fact that I was like, look, I have priorities. My foot is well enough that I can get through this winter and I feel okay. It feels good when I roll the weight through my feet during certain things when I can go to yoga, which was not that frequent either. The fact that I didn't fixate on it and make it a tragedy and everything, I think that made it so that now that spring has come into full blossom and now that I'm barefoot hiking again, there is no longer any memory of that injury in my foot, because you can really add to the trauma there in your tissues if you add all this emotional weight to it. But basically, it was a very tender spot on my foot during this whole last winter. And now I've actually forgotten about it until I'm talking about it today, because I didn't add any drama to it. I just didn't make it my priority to obsessively try to get blood flow to my foot while I'm indoors during the winter. And I was walking outside a lot, but it was in the mucklucks and my foot was slightly immobilized, so it didn't heal that fast. And it's all okay because now we're in a season of great healing, and I have done so much barefoot hiking that the circulation has more than gone in and fixed everything. So thank you for watching. Remember that the main takeaways, if you are going into transitioning yourself, are: number one, your first line of defense is critical thinking about the place that you're at. Have you explored this terrain in minimalist shoes before? That's step number one. When I'm in San Antonio, the first time that I was there, when I was into this whole thing, I was wearing those water shoes that are highly permeable because they're highly minimalist, and they got punctured by all sorts of extremely spiky things. Spiky plants that I would not want to walk across barefoot because of their frequency. In Utah, they'll be here and there. In San Antonio, they were everywhere. So there are many places there that I was not going to barefoot walk at all. In fact, I would wear the thickest sole minimalist shoe that I had, the men's Vivo Barefoot. So it's still a minimalist shoe, but that sole is not going to be punctured as much as the water shoe. So you have to think about where you're at. And definitely, if you wouldn't do it in a highly minimal shoe, then you wouldn't do it barefoot. So you have to try it out in a minimalist shoe and see what it's like. And then from there, you have to explore. Now, the more that you study the gait pattern and everything from this channel, the more that you will learn that you are really pushing off your back foot. Walking is not falling onto your front foot. It's pushing off your back foot. Your back foot has you. Your back leg has all your weight. So as your front foot is advancing, you have the ability to pull up if the ground feels fishy. Okay, you're keeping your weight on the back leg. And so you have to be able to come out of something. If you start to step down on something hazardous, you're able to pull up because your back leg has you. So your technique matters. So watch all the other videos and everything. And then finally, do not set yourself up to be barefoot in the dark. If you can't see, if that sunlight can't glint off of sharp metallic or glass objects, you're not going to be able to avoid it. And it doesn't matter if there's no glass and no metal, because the glass and metal reflect light. But when it's light outside, you can also see generally what are the rocks that you're going to be stepping on. Does that look uneven? Does that look, you have to know how big it is or else your foot's going to crash into it when it's dark. So do not put yourself in that situation. If there's any likelihood that you're going to be out past dark, then you can have your barefoot experience, but keep minimalist shoes on your person that are nice and portable so that you can put those on when it gets dark, because it's just not worth it. It's just not worth it. Of course, your foot is more likely to get injured when it's less pliable if it's colder out, so just realize also that the less pliable, the more an impact is going to be hard, and the harder it's going to be to recover because it's so cold outside. You can't get the level of circulation that you get when it's warm outside. So I tend to be a little more risk averse if it's winter, because I know that healing takes so long in the winter. And then just be aware that for me, I toe kick only when I'm worrying about something, when I'm in a frenzied state of mind. So you can't let yourself worry. If I were to move to a new location, I would have to have a whole new story of trial and error and learn everything about where I was. So I'm just never worried about it when I go out because I'm pretty aware of all the risks, and it's just reflexive which ones to avoid. Now, I just want to close by saying that there is a risk always. But the thing is, I'm aware of all the risks. When I go drive on the freeway, when I drive to get across the state to somewhere else, I am aware that driving can lead to an accident. And driving leading to an accident is a much bigger fear in my life than hurting my feet when I'm barefoot. But I trust when I get in the car, I don't sit there and think about it and just go, oh, I can't believe anyone drives. I'm never going to do that. Because at the end of the day, you can't live from fear. You live from the perspective that, okay, look, usually when I go drive or take the train or anything, because there's hazards to all forms of transportation. Usually when I go and drive, nothing bad happens. And it's because I'm very aware of my environment. I have the ability to do defensive driving if I have to. If there's a careless driver around me, I'll be able to deal with it. And if I can't, if the worst happens, well, I'm just banking on the fact that I'm going to get through it. That's what people think or don't think when they go out and drive. They just take certain precautions. Usually nothing happens. If something were to happen, it probably wouldn't be that bad. If something really horrible were to happen, hopefully you're aware enough of your surroundings that you can get away from it, swerve away from it and avoid crashing into something. And of course, at the end of the day, we just accept that absolute risk, the fact that something horrible could happen, but we trust ourselves that we're not going to willfully get ourselves into a horrible crisis and that probably nothing's going to happen. Okay, that's generally my same approach to barefoot walking and hiking. Now, I know my terrain very well, just like I know the roads that I drive on very well. Something absolutely catastrophic could happen to my feet tomorrow, but probably not. And I do trust myself that if some big spike were sticking out of the ground, that I would be able to just simply avoid it. And I also trust that if a really bad injury were to happen to my feet, that I'd be able to heal. Risk is not the only thing we evaluate. We also evaluate the reward. The rewards of barefoot hiking, especially in areas that are so familiar and so low risk and everything, the reward is so great that yes, I go on barefoot hikes and sometimes I get distracted and kick my toe and then I go, oh man, why did I do that? And then I just keep going. Because overall, the reward is usually much higher than the risk. And I have become so familiar with the risks that sometimes the risks start to outweigh the rewards, especially when those temperatures drop. And then I will cover and protect my feet. So there's always a calculus. There's always something that you are thinking through and you're weighing it out in your mind. So I hope that you realize that you too could weigh out the risk and the reward in your mind each day and that you will make the right decision.